Hey team, welcome back to the show. Today we are working through part 3 of the training mistakes series, talking through hamstrings, aka how to get the hamstring hang. I'm not sure who added that to the outline, but I like it. So, like we have done in the last couple episodes, again, just talking through how to optimize your hamstring training. I would say hamstrings are probably one of the more neglected muscle groups, but quite important for achieving the posterior most people want. Like if you have great glutes, I don't know, I don't know if we really, it seems like great glutes and great hamstrings a lot of times go hand in hand. You oftentimes don't see someone with like extremely well developed glutes and poor hamstrings. We're typically good at hinging and things of that nature, but very important and often overlooked muscle group. So I am excited to get into it. So again, really going to be a deep dive into the common training mistakes for hamstrings that we see clients making and why they are not changing. Before we really dig into that, Andrea, Natalie, any additional thoughts as far as selling the listeners on why hamstring training is so important?
I think it's one of those muscles that you don't realize that that's what you are liking when you see a physique, but
Mhm.
it really does make somebody look just very athletic and like gives such a nice shape.
Mhm. It adds so much more shape to your leg. Again,
Hmm.
if you're just like the back of your leg past your glute is just like flat or almost like kind of inverted looking, it's just not the
Hmm.
best look. Cool. All right, so go
Yes.
ahead,
Also,
Natalie.
I have to add my 2 cents on like the functional reason that we should care. Which is what we'll get into later is the effects of like knee stabilization that hamstrings
Hmm.
have. And so for people with like knee issues, strong hamstrings are pretty important. So on the physique side of things, I totally agree. They add a really nice shape to the leg, a nice athletic look. But there's as per usual, there's more than just aesthetics that we should care about.
Absolutely. So,
Not
as you
not
said,
that I do. Not that I do care about those things, but I'm saying we should.
but it's a nice byproduct. And in the ideal world, we
Exactly.
would care about those things, and it can be very important for knee stability and overall, like our knee health. Okay, so per usual, I want to get into some foundational knowledge you may need to have to make the episode the most helpful. So, Andrea, can you talk us through a hamstring anatomy?
Yes. So the hamstrings are made up of three major muscle groups. So we have the biceps femoris, the semitendinosus, and the semimembranosus. So biceps femoris, you'll kind of see two major like strands of the hamstring, which are like more superficial, like closer to the skin, and toward the outside of your leg, that's the biceps femoris. Toward the inside, it's the semitenosis, and then kind of like deep to those is the semimembranosus. So my biceps femoris originates at the pelvis, and so there's a couple heads to it. So one originates at the pelvis, the other originates at the femur, and inserts at the fibula and tibia. So those are like your shin bone. um Action for these: the long head extends the hip. So extending the hip, think like an RDL, pushing your hips forward, and also flexes the knee. So think like a leg curl motion. And the short head flexes the knee because it doesn't cross over at the hip. They'll both also externally rotate. So like rotate your leg out when the knee's bent. And then semitendinosus, that originates at the ischial tuberosity, which is like the very bottom little loop on the bottom of your pelvis, and then inserts at the tibia. And that's responsible for hip extension, knee flexion, and then internal rotation. So rotating your leg in toward the inside with your knee bent. And then semimembranosus, that one that's deeper, that originates at the ischial tuberosity, and inserts at the tibia. So that extends your hip, flexes your knee, and internally rotates the leg.
Okay. Basically, we have a couple big chunks of muscle running more or less straight up and down your leg. Some attaching over the hip, some don't, but aiding in basically like hip extension and then attaching to our lower leg bone, our shin bone, helping with flexing your knee, so like pulling your foot towards your butt.
Which is why you want to do some of both of those movement patterns, because if you're only doing one, you're going to be neglecting part of the muscle.
So like a hip hinge and a leg curl.
Hmm.
Okay. Anything else in terms of anatomy, core understandings that you would add, Natalie, that you think we glossed over?
No, I think some things might kind of come out as we get into the discussion.
Okay. So how we have been running this prior is working through some mistakes and then putting together a list of our favorite movements. That said, hamstrings are very limited in terms of the amount of good exercises we have for them. So we were thinking the best way to put this together would be first just talk through almost always like what our three core movements for hamstrings are going to be. And then from there we can talk through mistakes on each. Natalie, what would you say are going to be like the three movements you're typically going to run for hamstrings?
We've got for let's start with hip flexion, okay, and extension. So we've got the RDL and RDL adjacent would be the stiff-legged deadlift, which we can
Mhm.
probably talk about a little bit here. So your hinge movement, and then we've got a seated leg curl and a lying leg curl, and I will very quickly gloss over like something like a half kneeling leg curl if your gym has one available.
I would say it's very rare I've been able to program a half kneeling leg curl just because it's not very commonly available. But I would, yeah, for sure, like seated
It
leg
also
curl.
wouldn't be like my first choice either.
Yeah.
Correct.
Like even if my gym has one and I like, tried it once for kicks. And then if you really wanted to talk about it, you could also talk about like a 45-degree extension.
Okay, that's a good shot as well, actually. Okay, I like that. So we have kind of two hinges, some type of RDL slash stiff-legged deadlift. We have like a 45-degree hip extension. Then probably a lying leg curl and a seated leg curl are going to be our go-tos here.
Yeah, I think to follow up on Andrea's intro, like you want to train like hip extension and knee flexion, right? So you're gonna have because it's biarticular muscle, so crossing two joints, you want to train both.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
that's why
Okay.
like these movements are kind of like they seem so varied, right? Whereas like, when we're talking about things like the glute, it's like there's always like hip flexion and then a little bit of knee flexion element there. Like the movements are very similar patterns, but I think that's what's kind of so nerdily fun to talk about here is that there's like a little bit of a variety.
Okay. Let's start with then our RDL slash stiff-legged RDL. Do we just want to categorize this as like one? Do we just want to go like stiff-legged RDL or y'all have a preference? I don't. Do you guys program a stiff-legged RDL often?
Not
I don't.
often, every once in a while, if somebody really needs some hamstrings and I want to
And it's
bias those, or we already have, like, we're using a couple different hinges in the week, sometimes I'll specify those.
yeah, and
Okay.
like limited setups as well.
Yeah. That's like my client Carrie who trains at home. She's like has a lying leg curl. This is like one of the ones that's attached to a bench and just like really bad profile and like hamstrings
Oh,
were a priority for her. So that's where we did actually program like a stiff-legged RDL. And she also tended to just be very glute dominant in her normal RDL. But yeah, outside of that, not a whole lot of instances that I would. But let's talk through then. Just it sounds like RDL. Yes, like we will get a lot of glute involved. We will also get a decent bit of hamstring involved. But let's start there. Natalie, what would you say with like our RDLs is one of the biggest mistakes you see?
I guess I'll start with old reliable, which we've all talked about before, and that is like weight too far in the heels.
Elaborate for us. Why is that a
Uh,
mistake?
so it's a center of mass issue, and it's basically just we're not kind of putting the weight in like full foot pressure, which is what we need in order to like actually recruit like those posterior fibers.
Hmm.
Um, I think we should probably start out also with the deadlift, just talking about the fact that like we kind of glossed over stiff leg versus conventional RDL, but with the conventional RDL, there's going to be a little bit more knee bend. And so stiff leg, there's going to be a little bit less knee bend, and that's why it tends to kind of like recruit more of the hamstring. So that's the differentiation here. But of course, even if your knees are bent slightly in like a more of a conventional RDL, your hamstrings are still going to be getting stimulus. So that's important to point out. But a lot of the mistakes here really come down to, again, like weight too far in the back of the heels, and not getting that full foot pressure, or just like improper pelvic positioning there.
Okay. Okay. And similarly with the weight kind of being too far back in the heels, I feel like a lot of this, the RDL, we can probably move through pretty quickly as we already touched on a lot of this in the glute episode, and a lot of the mistakes are very similar still. But as you talked about in that episode, Natalie, if the weight is too far, as like in our heels, our toes are coming up, and our knees are moving backwards simultaneously with our hips. Problem there is, like we mentioned, hamstring, or at least one of the heads of the hamstring attaching over both the hip and crossing both the knee and the hip. If our knee is moving backwards at the same time that our hip is moving backwards, we're not going to be able to really stretch the hamstring well, right? We need like one fixed point, the knee, in this case, like kind of being that fixed point, and the hip pushing back further from that to really lengthen and stretch it. Um, Go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, similarly there, so using that same train of logic, right, where it's like we want one joint to be stable, right, while the other moves, origin to insertion, um, squatting your deadlifts.
Mhm.
So we see that a lot. So even in a more like, if you really want to call it like a bent knee RDL, you see like, the hips moving back, but then the knees moving forward, and we end up really kind of like squatting it. So even though like in your example, Jeremiah, the knees were moving back, and like we don't want that either. But similarly, we also like don't want to be like squatting this hinge.
Yeah. And that's like we talk a lot about like the shin angle, and sometimes I'll tell someone like, hey, we do want like a slight positive shin angle here, maybe depending on the person. So like your knees might be slightly forward in front of your ankles, but what we don't want that to turn into is like the bottom half of the rep. Your knees are continuing to move forward, and your hips, you'll actually see like your hips are moving forward as well. We're like shifting more tension to our quads and less, and like losing more tension in our glutes and hamstrings in that instance. In terms of RDL mistakes, Andrea, anything that you want to bring up here?
I would also say, and this kind of works in conjunction with these other mistakes too, because it has a lot to do with the center of mass, but like dropping the hips, which is kind of squatting it. But even if it's not like a very squatty pattern, if we're not keeping the hips high, we just don't get as much stretch on the glutes and hamstrings in the movement, and it does shift a little bit more of that tension to the quads. So even sometimes it won't look squatty, but we will get like hips back, and then at the very end dip and then come back
Hmm.
up. So if we just kind of stop the rep just before that point where we get that dip, or cue to keep the hips up high, that will usually fix that issue.
Okay. Okay. I like that. I really feel like most of the mistakes here, again, I think everything else I could talk about in terms of RDLs, we've kind of already covered in the glute episode. Again, it's just so much interlap. I don't necessarily want to repeat the same thing again. Do you guys have anything else you would like to add in terms of like the Romanian deadlifts? Cool. Okay. Let's talk then hamstring curls. Let's start with a seated. Natalie, what would you say in terms of like a seated hamstring curl? Biggest mistake that stands out to you that you're normally correcting?
Not stabilizing the pelvis, number one.
Okay. Okay. Elaborate on
And I think
that.
like any kind of like hamstring movement, because we are focused on like the what's happening at the hip, right? That's why like a lot of these quote faults are going to be like hip centric, like pelvic
Hmm.
function centric. Um I just think that's important to kind of like point out in terms of continuity between these episodes for people. Like a lot of these flaws and faults that we're pointing out in these movements directly relate to like what the function is.
Yeah.
So like, and I just mentioned that because I think it's helpful for people to be able to like logically understand like why this is problematic and like what they can
Hmm.
maybe look out for themselves.
Yeah.
So a lot of times, like with the seated leg curl, what we'll see is like an excessive like arch in the back, right? Or like your back is shifting away from the back pad. And you're seeing an excessive arch, like in the low back. So that pelvis is like basically tipping forward. And that really tells us that the pelvis is not stable, and it needs to be in order to get the best leverage and therefore force expenditure from the hamstrings.
Okay. So basically, if our pelvis is moving a lot, we are losing force output.
Yeah.
And I would say that, I mean, similar for a lion leg curl. We want to like mesh the two. Same thing. When you see someone moving a lot of the pelvis, they're like extending their lower back. This will more look like their butt is like being pulled up towards their lower back as they come up on each rep. We're not doing a good job stabilizing the pelvis, and thus we're going to get worse force output from our hamstrings.
Right. And then also like to contrast this with what we were talking about with hinge movements, right? So when we're talking about the hinge movements, like we're trying to stabilize the knee, right? So that the pelvis can move. Likewise, here we're trying to train knee flexion, right? And extension. So therefore we want the pelvis to be stable.
Mhm.
So that's their corollary.
Yeah, I love it. Andrea, in terms of seated leg curls, any major mistakes you often see?
I mean, that's the biggie, but I would say doing too much with the feet and leg shin angles. So a lot of times it is like legs are externally rotated and feet are out way too wide. You just don't really need to be abducted there. Just keep your toes straight up toward the ceiling and shins straight. Hip width, just like we've talked about with like the RDLs, feet hip width is kind of the best position there. Same thing with the seated leg curl or lying leg curl.
Yeah, they're like it'll be like your ankle. I typically tell people we want a straight line between hip joint, knee joint, and ankle joint on both like
Mhm.
your leg extensions, leg curls. But a lot of times what you'll see is, yeah, like people's ankle joint is way outside their knee joint if you were like looking at this from the front, which just the torque that puts on our knee,
Mhm.
the stress it puts on our knee is going to be unnecessary, potentially a bit detrimental. And even from like a force output perspective, it won't be the best setup. The feet as well, that's another one. Like I typically prefer someone dorsiflex a little bit more. So basically like pull their feet up towards, think of like pulling the top of your foot up towards your face and staying in that position the entire time. Basically, like our gastroc muscle, one of the muscles of our calves, really integrates with the hamstring, and that will really help stabilize the knee. So for both like our leg extensions and leg curls, actually, it's a good idea to like have your feet dorsiflexed. But it is, you will often see people are like really externally rotated and like a lot of plantar flexion. They're like pointing their feet away from them the entire time. Um, Anything else in terms of seated? I would say, I guess the other one, yeah, would be like launching from the top of the rep. I mentioned the
Yeah.
gastroc being really involved in that, like again, one of the muscles of the calf. So really for that first like 15 degrees of knee flexion, the gastroc is going to be like the primary mover actually before the hamstring takes over more. So if you are, a lot of times what people will do is like launch from the top of the rep, you'll see like a really aggressive start to like pull the weight down from the top of a seated leg curl, or from the bottom, really launch the weight up in a lion leg curl, in which case it is going to be your gastroc, your calf muscle doing a lot of the work, and then a lot of momentum carrying it up, carrying the weight up from there, because we have inertia now, right? Like an object in motion stays in motion. So thus it is going to be a lot more of our calf doing the work. We're not going to challenge the hamstring as well. I typically like a little bit slower start on my leg curl variations.
I'll also typically have people add a little bit of a pause in the contracted position just to like
Mhm.
really reinforce, like make your hamstring do this work and then let's slowly go through the eccentric. That tends to help a lot too.
Yeah. I started to like a bit of a pause in both end ranges actually, like a bit of a pause in the stretch and pause in the short position because it just makes people be so much more intentional with that. I find this is one people really get pretty sloppy with, and like you see, like there's a lot of
Yeah.
momentum. Your hips are moving forward and back. Um, Similar to your point too about stabilizing the pelvis, Natalie. Like really, just you'll see a lot of times people like trying to hold on to the side of the machine, like next to the seat of the machine, next to their butt, like they're doing like a leg extension. Here, if you're doing like a seated leg curl, Put your hands on the pad in front of you, push yourself back into the seat and be really intentional about that. That like little simple thing. It's funny how few people do that actually. But the thing here is initially, like if you look at the way the seated leg curl is pulling you initially, for you to be able to pull that weight back underneath you, the weight it essentially wants to pull your body forward. And you need to be able to resist that force to again like get the best output from our hamstrings, have the best leverage. So really actively pushing yourself back into the seat with your hands on the pad in front of you. Very, very important. And again, just so few people are doing that. And you see again them just like sliding halfway up the seat in every rep.
And if you only have the one with the shin pad, just get a new gym.
I actually don't. I mean, the thing is though, with the one with the shin pad, it doesn't allow you to move forward at all like that because the shin
I
pad is
just
keeping
hate
you there.
I just don't like
I
it.
also don't like it. I disagree. I agree. I also don't like it. But um, anything else in terms of seated leg curls y'all throw out there?
Yeah, I will add because this I see this get butchered all the time is people trying to do the hinge forward
I
with
knew
the
you were
seated
gonna add that.
leg. And like in theory, I'm there, but it just is usually butchered and poorly executed, and people are like slumped over kind of
Yeah.
thing. And
All it
that's
is like allowing then we don't even have the back pad to help stabilize pelvis and they're just going like this with their pelvis forward and back.
yeah, it just is so misapplied and butchered. So just don't stop it.
So, and the theory behind that is because
You
hamstrings
get
again will
a stretch.
right hamstrings attach over your hip, but with us being in a more hip flexion, if we're leaning forward, we're in greater hip flexion. She should get a greater stretch still at the start. But yeah, that's again, we need to actually be like getting more of an anterior pelvic tilt there, where it's typically people are just rounding forward. And I never coach that, honestly. I find just like you also lose the aspect of being able to like really stabilize by pushing yourself back into the seat. I think like what we trade off in like pelvic stability there, we're not gonna get a whole lot out of like an additional stretch.
You're
I don't.
already in a pretty good stretch just because you're
Right.
seated with your feet in front of you. So
I
Right.
promise, like that is not what's holding back your progress. Like for anyone out there, like that's the silver bullet that you're missing. It's not.
Anything else on seated before we move on to lying a little bit more?
It is a goaded movement for hamstrings because of the ability to stabilize.
Hmm.
And so, given a choice, like that's top tier, like for hamstrings. And I get frustrated sometimes because I have had clients whose gyms like only have a lying leg curl,
yeah.
Yeah.
which does not follow, it doesn't track with like my logic or line of thinking. Um, and I remember, I remember my client Noelle, like it had, you know, her gym in Philadelphia. They like did not have a seated leg curl, and I like called them to ask them why not, and like blew up their Instagram pages. And I'm happy to report that they have one now. So I like, that's how angry it makes me. Just like, so
Very
if you're my
passionate
client,
about.
like, and I ask you what gym you go to, it might be because I'm gonna contact them.
And I mean, again, to bring it back to the anatomy discussion we had at the start, the long head crossing both the hip joint and the knee joint, short head crossing just the knee joint, us doing a seated leg curl where we're in more hip flexion, we will be able to effectively train both, right? We're in some hip flexion, we're also moving at the knee. Well, we should be staying in hip flexion, but we'll be able to train both heads quite well. Whereas we don't have that hip flexion element in our lying leg curl. We can still make progress if we just have a lying leg curl, but the very strong argument there for like the seated leg curl. If we had to choose one, I would for sure go with a seated leg curl. And yes, also like a stability perspective, our ability to brace. The lying leg curl can be quite a lot harder for people to really get mastered, which let's transition into that. Um, Andrea, any major mistakes you see in terms of lying leg curl that you feel like you have to correct often?
We already, I mean, it's the same thing that we touched on before, but the pelvis rotating. So, like you said, it looks like as you curl your legs, your butt just pops up into the air.
Hmm.
So how you can help correct that is to pull down on the handles, kind of like you're doing a lat pull down on those
Mhm.
the handles that'll be kind of like up by your head. And like we talked about in the first episode of this, the lats can actually have a role in stabilizing the pelvis. So if you engage your lats, that helps to stabilize. And then you can also kind of squeeze your butt down and then curl your legs so it keeps your pelvis as stable as possible.
That's a big one. A lot of times I see people, it just looks like their upper body's relaxed. And you get like really kind
Mhm.
of pull yourself into your handle, into those handles more.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, I had another one, and I had one that I wanted to say. Oh, and for both lying and seated, lying, simple thing that just makes the movement feel so much better. Just lining your knee joint up with the pivot
Oh, yeah.
point of the lever arm of the machine. So there's again like the whole bulk of the machine, and then there's the lever arm with the ankle pad. Right? There will typically be like where that lever arm joins with the rest of the machine. There will be like a red or yellow sticker that is there to call your attention to it because that's we basically want that lined up with our knee joint for a seated leg curl, a lying leg curl, a leg extension. We just won't be in the correct position. The machine will feel kind of uncomfortable and awkward. Like if your knees are way in front of that and you're trying to do like a seated leg curl, you just won't have very good leverage at all. It'll feel so the movement will just feel so weird. Like the arc of is way different. And it will want to like pull you forward even more. It's just a
Mhm.
very uncomfortable movement. That's such a little thing that so many people aren't doing. Like almost everyone we need to correct when they start coaching. But goes a long ways. What do you got,
Also
Natalie,
with
in terms of a
the
lie?
ankle
Go ahead.
pad, sorry, Natalie, are you getting ready to get into this exact same thing?
Sure, actually.
The ankle
Take it away.
pad, you want the ankle pad like where your kind of like where your Achilles turns into the bottom part of your calf. Because if you have it way down like over your shoe or way up on the gastroc part of your calf, it's just not right.
Perfect.
Thing you touched on, Jeremiah, with the seated leg curl applies here too, is like the launching from the bottom.
Hmm.
So like kind
Yeah.
of think about more like flinging the weight up in a lying leg curl.
Mhm.
Um, don't want that.
Yeah. No, I see that extremely commonly. Anything else with the lion leg curl? I feel like hamstrings are such a simple one relative to everything else we've talked about.
I think people underestimate how quote advanced a lying leg curl is. It is the more difficult option, and it's because it is harder to stabilize the pelvis.
Mhm.
So given the choice, I will choose a seated curl. If we have both, I might program both. But of course, like we're gonna look at form reviews. People do really tend to struggle with the stabilizing of the pelvis. I will say, like, this can be taken to an extreme with the lying curl because there is going to be some movement to some extent.
Yeah.
Like, I have yet to see or even execute myself, like, absolutely zero shift of the pelvis. Like, that's pretty damn near impossible. It's just something to be mindful of. Um, I think oftentimes in like programming application, we will program them fairly early on in a training plan because it does tend to like warm up knee flexion. So even on like a quad day or something like that, like I really do like something like a seated leg curl ahead of like our pendulum squat or our hack squat or something like that. It is antagonist to the quads. So we warm up the knees like really nicely there. But we also get hamstring stimulus too.
Yeah.
So, that's one of those things where, hey, maybe the hamstrings aren't necessarily the, priority muscle group. Like there are just many reasons to kind of like utilize these movements.
Mhm. Lion leg curl is going to get us a nice lengthened sartorius, though,
And who
which is
doesn't want
actually an important, which is actually an important part of knee stability. Um, no, when deciding like when to program between the two of them, I would almost always like I'm gonna have one seated leg curl at least if we have it available. I mean anytime we are, even if we're doing like a hinge pattern in the same day, like if I have somebody training lower body twice a week, I'm gonna have them doing a hamstring curl variation twice a week as well, almost always. It's just so important and so overlooked. When deciding like is one of those like one of those a seated leg curl and was one of those a lying leg curl, or are they both seated? A lot of times I will just buy a seated. What makes y'all decide like when you might do a lying instead of a seated? I will say like depending on how they hinge, if there's someone who's like if we're doing an RDL and they're like a little bit more balanced there, and it's like okay, I feel like this isn't like an extremely glute dominant hinge. Like we are getting a decent amount of hamstring involved in this also. I'm a lot more likely to like program a line leg curl rather. So like a little bit more. I mean, we'll still fail on the short on both, but like not quite getting as much of a lengthen challenge there. But what's helping you guys decide like where to you might go with a lying over a seated? Outside of just that's all that's available.
Execution, so again, like how well they do execute is I'd be like after some coaching, like of course we're gonna take a
Hmm.
look and apply, give you room for improvement. It's not like it's not like pass fail, like you get
Right.
one crack at it and that's out. Like we're gonna work on it a little bit, but there are also some like accessory movements we could bring into like if all you have available is a lying leg curl, there are things that we can do to like help you get better at that, like pelvis stabilization, like even some planks and things like that. But I tend to like if they execute a line okay and they have access to both, a lot of times like in my decision making, I'll kind of like what we talked through with, utilizing something to like warm up the knee flexion. Like I'll use a lying leg curl more for that. So like earlier in the session, and I'll like make the leg curl more of like a priority lift, if that makes sense. But I have many clients who either don't have a lying leg curl or maybe they don't execute it well. And also, for all the reasons we discussed, I just really like a seated leg curl because it's just so stable and it's great for output. Sometimes, like what I'll do is, I'll put it like early in one of their lower body days. And so we do get the benefit of like warming up that knee flexion, but then also it's earlier in the session. So we're driving like some priority stimulus there. And then like maybe their other lower body session, I'll put it like later in the session and, maybe with like higher reps or something like that. So, you are getting a little variation there just by way of exercise order, rep range. So you're kind of getting like two different takes on it, so to speak.
Okay. In terms of a 45-degree hip extension, is that ever something you guys are programming as a primary hamstring movement?
Personally, no, because I've just found it's hard to load enough. It's more of like a primer or a teaching tool because of that pelvis stability that you get from the pad.
I would agree. I will program it as like a primary, like short challenge glute movement, but I I would agree. And like, hey, we might get a side of hamstrings here. Nice, but I'm not typically going to program it as like a primary glute or a hamstring movement.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same. Like, it's not
Okay.
like, oh, we want to prioritize hamstrings. This is my go-to. It's like I'll be
Mhm.
using it for other reasons. And like, hey,
Mhm.
cool, we'll get some hamstrings there too.
Cool.
Somebody has a glute builder brand 45 degree. Those are very, very nice, but haven't come across any of those yet.
Like the lever arm ones.
Where you can go lower feet for a little more hamstring or higher
Hmm.
feet for glutes.
Yeah, those are
Love that
sick.
machine. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a fan as well. I was actually talking to Nick yesterday about how you guys are gonna move here and we're gonna just open a gym,
Where you
private gym. Yeah, so
I've tried to
we'll get
tell
it.
him we need to open a gym here because it's needed, but he's not on
Sounds like
board.
it's opening in Phoenix, I guess. He was, anyways,
Is Walmart opening a new?
Underground out of your garage.
I'm out of my one car garage. My garage is so full right now. I have to wheel a
Not
bunch of stuff
you.
out. Oh, okay.
And
Okay, there
then
you
they
go.
could do like this like underground fight club style, like bodybuilding gym.
It's perfect.
No.
Anything else in terms of lion leg girls or hamstrings in general before we wrap this up?
Wish there was more to it. It's
I
like
know,
racked brain.
I know. It just really is. Hey, we're probably going to want to do at least one hip hinge a week. Same, it goes for our glutes. And we are probably going to want to train the knee flexion element with like a leg curl variation, probably twice within a standard week. And that's basically your hamstring training.
Actually, I will add something. Um, and that is like I gotta credit like Prescript for this knowledge. But there is an interesting thing here. So in the beginning of the movement, sorry, we shifted into classical music here. The beginning of the podcast, I did kind of shout out like, why it might be important from a function perspective to train hamstrings. That is like to stabilize like the knee joint. And I said, so anyone with like knee issues. So an interesting factoid here is that the hamstrings and the what ACL share function. So they basically do the same thing, which is stabilize the knee joint, right? But the ACL like isn't a muscle you can train, but the hamstrings are. So I think it's important, so for people who are having like ACL issues or like I feel like everyone here has like heard about like someone with an ACL injury if they haven't had one themselves, right? And so when we're talking about like knee rehabilitation, like this is why you might want to care about hamstrings. Like it's those things like the ACL and hamstrings share the same function to stabilize the knee joint. And again, we can't train the ACL, we can train the hamstrings.
Love it. Yeah, very, very important. Especially like not that we can train a lot of athletes, but like in an athletic population, very, very important for like prevention of ACL issues.
100%. Like I was kind of like reading up on it and like more on the S&C side of things, so like strength and conditioning, which again, not necessarily our bread and butter. We were like much more like concerned with hypertrophy, but obviously it's like a Venn diagram. There's a lot of overlap there, but you'll often hear about like on the S&C side of things, like that's why it's so important to incorporate things like sprinting and sprinting mechanics, right?
Interesting. Literally all I care about is getting jacked. But
I
on
I just
that,
mention it, but now we can just go back to talking about getting jacked.
no, no, I'm just kidding. I think that's a very cool point. Before we wrap this up, anything else y'all would like to add? I really don't have anything else to contribute. Cool. Well, get that hamstring hang, y'all. If you enjoyed the show, do us a huge favor, leave us a 5-star rating and review. If you would like to apply to work with the team, hit the link in the show notes, and we will catch you guys next time.